Hello everyone who's joining us for the Pine Martin's class story, which is still the world's worst children. We're on our third instalment of Nigel, Knit Boy. Knits are itchy, knits are scratchy, knits are scritchy, knits are a nuisance. Not for Nigel. Nigel was a boy who could never have enough knits. He wanted his hair crawling with them. Our tale begins on the morning that Nigel woke up to discover he had a knit living in his hair. Most of us would be appalled and immediately try to evict the knit. Not Nigel. He was delighted. The boy called this knit Mr. Henderson. Nigel didn't have a dog or a cat or a hamster, so he treated his knit like a pet. He made sure he never combed his hair. Knits hate combs. Soon, Nigel's hair was wild and frizzy, like a great big bush, a jungle paradise for knits. Nigel fed Mr. Henderson tidbits of dandruff. Knits loved dandruff, in the hope of training him to do tricks, like leaping from one side of Nigel's head to the other. Soon afterwards, Nigel heard of another child at school who had knits. Her name was Tina Ting. Nigel wanted Nina's knits more than anything in the world. He wanted knits, knits and more knits. At break time, Nigel chased the poor girl around the playground. "What do you want?" cried Tina tearfully. "I'm not playing it." "I want your knits," replied the boy. "My knits? You are nuts," yelled the girl. "Yes, I'm nuts for knits," said Nigel. The boy tripped over a skateboard and flew through the air towards her. Clonk! Their heads bashed, and in an instant Tina's knits crawled over to Nigel's head. A little dazed, the boy was none the less happy. Now Mr. Henderson had some company. The next day, Nigel heard of a boy in school who had knits. Colin Clont. Nigel wanted those knits so badly. So he chased Colin down the corridor and cornered him in the toilets. The trembling boy locked himself in a cubicle, but Nigel would not give up. He climbed over the top of the next cubicle and dangled upside down from the ceiling. Nigel's and Colin's hair were knocked together. Bonk! Once again, knits sprang across to Nigel's head. Even the school cat was not safe from Nigel's advances. When Nigel was told that Minky the cat also had knits, he pursued the poor creature across the football field. Once he had caught the cat, he sellotaped it to his head. It looked like a very unconvincing wig. Still, one by one, the cat's knits bounded onto Nigel's head. Soon, Nigel had so many knits that even his knits had knits. He stopped counting them at about 1,000,003. Now, you may be wondering why Nigel wanted a head full of knits. Please, let me explain. Ever since he was a toddler, Nigel had spent his days reading comics. The boy was short for his age, if you don't count the wild bush of hair on top of his head, and he wanted to be strong and powerful like the characters in his comics. However, Nigel had had a very normal upbringing. He's not been lucky enough to have been bitten by a radioactive spider, or come from a Viking planet, or fallen down on a web of bats. Besides, he found superheroes a bit boring. They were always doing good. The supervillains were so much more thrilling. Before long, naughty Nigel had a plan. One morning, as the boy was standing in the bathroom cleaning his teeth, he looked at himself in the mirror. His hair was now not so much a bush, more of a hedgerow. Nigel could not remember the last time he had either cut or combed it. Buzzing in and out of his hedgerow of hair were millions of knits, forming a dark cloud around him. The day had finally come. My knit-based superpower is ready. From this day on, the world will know me only as Knit Boy. Best of all, the name hadn't already been taken. So now that Nigel had all his knits, he went about getting a costume made. Fortunately, the boy's Auntie Pat was quite good at sewing and put together a supervillain costume for her nephew in no time. Nigel wore a cape fashioned from one of his mum's skirt, his dad's old wife fronts, Wellington boots, his nana's tights, the NB logo from Knit Boy sewn by Auntie Pat. Nigel had his superpower. He had his name, his costume was on, he was Knit Boy. At once he began his supervillainy. The next morning he strode into school, his cape flapping in the wind. First, Nigel vowed to revenge on his geography teacher, Mr. Durham. Nigel found geography boring and spent most of his lessons reading comics. Mr. Durham had given the boy detention after detention. Now Knit Boy stood at the door to the classroom. Initially there were hoots of laughter from the other children. What with his costume and shrubland of hair, that would be a supervillain, did look quite a sight. Ha 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 ha! However, the laughter turned to silence, or as Knit Boy called out his first command, "Knits! Swarm!" The billions of knits that were whirling around his head formed a black mass next to him. "Nigel, what on earth do you think you're doing?" demanded Mr. Durham. "Knits! Attack!" shouted the boy. They swarmed the geography teacher, nipping him all over with their tiny knit claws. "Ah!" screamed Mr. Durham as he raced out of the classroom. All his pupils pressed their faces up against the window to watch their teacher. The man was trying desperately to fend off the knits. He was hopping and spinning and slapping himself as he sped across the playing fields towards the school pond. Mr. Durham then leaped in with a giant swalosh. He finally had some relief from the nips, though now he was submerged in green water with a fat frog sitting on his head. Knit Boy smiled to himself. This was going to be fun. Next, he marched across the playground to the dining hall. The dinner lady, Mrs. Droop, was something of a dragon. Boiled broccoli was her signature dish. Whatever you chose, even jam, roly-poly and custard, Mr. Droop would spoon heaps of green, watery mush on top. Then she would stalk up and down in the dining room, twirling her ladle like a baton, threatening to rap the knuckles of anyone who didn't eat up every last mouthful. Nigel hated broccoli. If Superman feared kryptonite, Knit Boy was terrified of broccoli. Now he was to have his revenge on the woman who had made him eat a mountain of it. "Nigel," she purred as he strode in, "why have you got your pants over your trousers?" "Ha ha ha ha!" Mrs. Droop's smile was wiped off her face as soon as Knit Boy shouted out his next command. "Knits! To the broccoli!" "I am not having you blasted head lice messing with my delicious broccoli," protested the dinner lady. Too late. The knits had swarmed into a whirling tornado. Mrs. Droop stood open-mouthed in shock as this twisting vortex spun over to her precious tray of broccoli. Then the tornado started, firing the damp, limp vegetables straight at Mrs. Droop. Splat, splat, splat. Soggy floret after soggy floret splattered across the woman's face until Mr. Droop was as damp, green vegetable mess. Now Knit Boy was ready to have his revenge on his headmaster. The elderly Mr. Sourchops had suspended Nigel from school after his 10th detention for reading comic books in lessons. The headmaster was a small and timid man, so Knit Boy thought he would frighten him. Nigel stood in the playground, just below the window of the headmaster's office. He closed his eyes in concentration. "Knits, shapeshift," he ordered. Slowly, the tiny insects swarmed together into the shape of a giant super knit. They were able to read their master's mind. As the boy kept his eyes tightly shut, a look of intense concentration on his face. The giant knit shape surged upwards to the headmaster's window. It banged on the glass with its huge claw. Clunk, clunk, clunk. Mr. Sourchops swiveled round in his chair and shrieked, "No!" The giant knit bashed its great head against the window, breaking the glass. Crack! "Help!" screamed the headmaster as he dashed out of his office. Running into the playground, Mr. Sourchops spotted a wheelie bin, checking behind himself all the time for the giant super knit. The little old man pushed the bin as hard as he could before leaping in it as it was speeding away. Finally, Knitboy opened his eyes and watched in glee as his headmaster trundled across the playground in a bin. It bashed into a low wall, clang, sending the little old man flying through the air straight into the tree trunk. Clunk! The knit swarmed back to the master's head as Nigel strode out of the school gates. There was plenty more supervillainy to be done. Not long after, Knitboy arrived in the market square, which was teeming with bargain hunters. Using his knits, Nigel spelled out the words of a very rude word in the sky. Bottoms. One old lady was so shocked she fainted at the sight. Next, Knitboy turned his attention to the local toy shop. The supervillain ordered his knits to steal every single item in the store, including the till. The shop owner chased the boy down the street, but he was whacked over the head by the knits with one of his own giant teddy bears. Yet there was still more chaos and destruction to come. Suddenly, light flashed and a siren wailed. The police had been sent to stop Nigel from creating further mayhem, but Knitboy ordered the knits to attack the police car, and they swarmed on its windscreen. The glass became so thick with knits that the policeman crashed into the shop window of opticians. Nothing could stop Knitboy now. He felt invincible. Soon the whole world would kneel before him. All hail Knitboy! Later that night, Nigel put on his pyjamas and was lying in bed. Even supervillains needed their sleep. The boy was dreaming up the next day's evil schemes. However, outside in the street stood a throng of townsfolk, armed not with flaming torches and pitchforks, as in the traditional with the angry mobs, but with an array of combs. Knitboy had to be robbed of his powers, and there was only one way to do that. They began to chant, "Comb his hair, comb his hair." The chant became louder and louder as the mob grew angrier and angrier. Nigel leapt from his bed and peeked out of his window. Looking down, he saw more and more people rushing out of their houses to join the horde. In swirling whirl of knits, Nigel changed out of his pyjamas to become Knitboy. He marched outside and approached the mob. With his Wellington boots on and his cape, which was really one of his mum's old skirts, flapping in the wind, Knitboy felt ready to take on the world. His millions of knits had now multiplied into billions or maybe trillions. They buzzed round the boy's head, blackening out the scattering of the stars in the night sky. "There he is," shouted someone. "It's Knitboy. Get him!" The mob surged forwards, brandishing their combs. The old lady, who had fainted in the market square, was holding a large bottle of anti-knit shampoo called Knits Blitz. On the label it said, "The swarm enemy of knit. This highly toxic and foul-smelling shampoo is poisonous to all known knits. It is guaranteed to kill knits until they are totally and utterly, completely dead." Unable to contain her anger a moment longer, the old lady hurled the bottle at Nigel. It bounced off his hair and hit her on the head, knocking her out cold. The boy still stood his ground. Once again, he commanded his knits, "Knits, lift!" The knits swooped down to create a hoverboard under his master's feet. Then they lifted him off the ground with laughable ease. The crowd gasped in shock. This supervillain could actually fly. The boy zoomed through the night sky, performing an impressive loop-the-loop before hovering over the mob. Now go back to your homes, or you will feel the full force of Knitboy. The townsfolk began muttering to each other dejectedly. They knew they were beaten, yet still no one moved. "Disperse!" Knitboy ordered the crowd. But his knits must have thought he was talking to them. Knits are not known for their intelligence. As far as I know, no knit has performed brain surgery or been involved in rocket science. So the knits dispersed. Led by Mr. Henderson, they all buzzed off in different directions, disappearing into the sky. Knitboy looked down at the people below. He gulped, and he began to plummet downwards. He tumbled through the air, desperately flapping his arms. "Help!" The crowd surged out of the way, and Nigel landed headfirst on the pavement. Fortunately, such was the volume of hair on his head that he survived the fall without injury. "Grab him!" shouted someone. Nigel was carried off to the local hairdresser, where his hair was washed with Knit Blitz shampoo, and he was given a very sensible short back and sides. All remaining knits or knits eggs were combed out of Nigel's hair, and he had to make a promise in front of the whole town. "I solemnly swear never ever to become Knitboy again." You might be surprised to learn, even though he was one of the world's worst children, Nigel kept his promise. Knitboy was never seen again. However, sometime later, Nigel came up with another supervillain to be. From now on, he would be known as Veruca Boy, a supervillain who refused to wear plastic socks at the swimming pool, therefore unleashing the plague of verrucas on the world. At the best part of that, Nigel could rescue the cape that was really his old mum's skirt. Right, well, that's the last one for today, The World's Worst Children. Join us again soon so we can catch up and see what other children have been up to. Bye.